We start this session with Jaime Pineda from Max Planck in Munich, structure of nearby molecular clouds revealed by ammonia.
So many thanks to the organizing committee for this opportunity, because I'll be presenting work from very different papers based on the gas survey, and it's something we haven't been able to go around and show that much. So it's a really nice opportunity. As they mentioned, I'm Jaime Pineda. I'm part of the gas group at MPE. And just a very brief overview of some of the differences between clouds and cores, which is what I would like to study at some point, is that even in the 80s, once they started to do the first observations of molecular lines of CO, they started to see that whenever they looked at some clouds and they measured the line width and they estimated the size of the region that they were observing, they saw this very interesting pseudo-universal relation of line width as a function of scale. So this is basically one of the first evidences for supersonic line widths and the nature of supersonic turbulence in molecular clouds. And this is basically Larson's law. Now, for example, once we see some of the Herschel results like this, you can see that Herschel revealed many substructures within molecular cloud. Filaments and cores are clearly depicted in these images. And you can see that the cores are very compact. And in these cases, many of these are protostellar cores. And what we would like to do is to see if we can actually see a transition between the molecular cloud and the core. So this is one of the nicest images of dense cores that usually we can show to the public, is because you can see in this three-color image, you can see the core is this dark patch, and outside you can see all the background stars. But once you start to get into the denser column densities, the higher column densities from the core, you can see that all the stars start to redden. That's the extinction, the visual extinction. Now it's a clear example. The light, the stars start to get redder. And you can then in the center, you only see them as red dots, meaning that in the optical or outside of the near infrared, they are undetectable. And those are the regions that in the old days, they used to be called dark clouds, because in optical images, they appear as dark spots. So in this case, the connection between the core and the cloud, how are they joining, it's a bit unclear, because one of the key properties of dense cores is that they appear to be subsonic. So how do we go from a supersonic cloud to a subsonic core? And I'll just show you the example of using one molecule, in this case, very simple. We'll just use one hammer and one nail for most of the talk. And this is ammonia, and we use it because it has all these features that you see here. They are actually hyperfine components on the transition. This is the 1-1 transition, and it's extremely useful to get the kinematic information. So you can get line widths and you can get centroids for the gas. In this case, if it's dense enough, you will see it in ammonia. So you can get accurate kinematics. And then the other advantage of using ammonia is that if you do an energy diagram, you can see that for different levels of the K ladder, they basically all have a metastable level at the bottom. And that means that if you are able to estimate the column densities or the intensities from these two for example, the 1-1 and the 2-2 transitions, you can make some weak assumptions about the physics of the gas and get a good estimate for what's the temperature. So that's why ammonia is one of the gold standards for temperature measurements in cold regions in particular. If you go to warmer regions, then you need to include many more of these transitions, but then also other species are actually much more useful. So in this case, if we're able to get deep observations of ammonia, we can get kinematics and we can get temperatures, and that is crucial to understand what's the dense gas doing. So in the case of dense cores, thank you. Dun, dun. Spiders. One, two. There we go. So if we want to look at the at cores, one of the initial efforts we did once they rebuilt the Green Bank telescope, which is a 100-meter telescope in West Virginia. So it was rebuilt in around the 2000s, and it allowed for really good observations in the frequencies for ammonia. And the good thing is that then we could measure that dense cores. They're actually subsonic, they're cold, and they're mostly dense. So in this case, we have a sample of all the cores that we had as possible objects in a single cloud. So in this case, it's a nearby molecular cloud, Perseus, and we targeted anything that looked like a core that was in any list. We did it. And for the detections, we could mark those that were protostellar and those that were starless. And you can see that the red and the blues, even though they don't lie on exactly the same place, on the same locus on this plot, you can see that almost all of the points still below this line of subsonic turbulence. So that is subsonic non-thermal motions, and that is, if we use that the non-thermal motions are a proxy for the turbulence, then it's subsonic turbulence, regardless of the protostellar nature of the core, which was a bit of a surprise for us because we were expecting the protostars, even if they're low mass, to make a little bit of an effort to mess it up. But you can see that maybe they are a little bit warmer, so they are in a little bit higher thermal line width, so a bit warmer, but still in the subsonic regime, very similar to starless. It could be also that it's due to the big beam that we're using in these observations, which is about 30 arc seconds. So we're working on trying to understand what's the reason behind. And then if we see subsonic and we know that the cloud is supersonic, then we want to know how is the transition. So once we managed to get some of these detections, we did one of the deep observations of ammonia on big maps of ammonia in these low mass transforming regions. And basically, the map here is the derived velocity dispersion on the whole, on the region, and the contour, the marks, basically the transition between subsonic and supersonic line widths. And if we go across this cut, I can show you a zoom into the main hyperfine component, and you can see that when you are in the core, in the white part, you can see these two features that are not two components. Those are actually the hyperfine components of the line. So if you have low enough turbulence, you can see the hyperfine components, and if you don't have low enough turbulence, then you start to fill in the gap, and the line brightness decreases. And that was one of the reasons why it was so hard to see this transition before, because it was about an order of 4 times fainter than the main core. So if you're doing like a standard technique of doing the map. You just make sure you have a detection. You go to the next pixel. In the old days, you integrate maybe a bit longer than the previous pixel, but if it's 4 times fainter, you're not going to see that. So that was one of the reasons why we couldn't see this transition. And we can see it's very sharp. It's a very sharp transition to coherence. And then we went for VLA observations, and we tried to see what's happening within this transition region. That used to be called a single core. And now when we look at it with the VLA, we can see that within this footprint, we can get this image, and there are filaments within it. So these are narrow filaments. These are not 0.1 parsec. These are a bit more like the fibers that Alvaro found, but the subsonic region is much larger than the filament footprint. So now we have a subsonic region that inside it, there is a filament, which further it's fragmenting, and it's not thermal Jeans fragmentation. It's possibly linked to some perturbations in the density field generated by most likely turbulence. Even if it's subsonic, it can still generate some seeds that can be taken away. Then another reason why to look for cores is that if we look for cores, we can try to study the amount of angular momentum. So this is a specific amount of angular momentum. That's the total amount of angular momentum in an object divided by the mass. And it is an interesting proxy to study the disk formation, because at some point we have some radial dependence on the angular momentum, and if gravity wins, that is a conservative force. Therefore, the angular momentum should be conserved, and that would provide an upper limit to the size of the largest disk that you can form without any MHD or any other mechanism for angular momentum dissipation or transport. So in this case, if we're able to study something like this, we can also try to see what should the simulations include or match. So these are actually useful observables for the simulators to compare. And as an example of what was the previous set of best maps before we started the survey, I can show you that we had these. This was the biggest, deepest in Perseus. Then we have this nice Orion map by D. Lee with the VLA. Then there is this huge torus mosaic in ammonia by Youngmin Seo. And these footprints were also observed in ammonia with the VLA by Rachel Friesen. So basically, those are some of the best. There are many seminal works by Bachiller and Serrincharo, for example, showing with Effelsberg in particular that ammonia is also a good tracer, but these are the previous generation of the maps, I would say. So what we did is we just had a big survey at the GBT. You can see an image of the big telescope there. We targeted mostly ammonia. Those were the key lines that we aimed for, and we tried to map everything that had a high enough column density that we expected to see ammonia in there, and with a sensitivity that was reasonable enough to get temperatures in the densest regions and to get kinematics in the fainter emission. So we knew that with this sensitivity, we could not get a temperature map throughout the whole cloud. So that was not feasible. But it allowed us to do some of the first kinematic analysis of this. And the first data release was in 2017, and we finally had the final release that all the data is available. It's public, including data products from line fitting. And this is just a couple of images from the DR1. So this is an image of AGC 1333, and I will show a couple of regions, only a couple, and there will be on the red, there will be the H2 column from Herschel. That would be kind of our ground truth for H2. Then we have interior intensity from ammonia here. You can see that they do match each other very well. So ammonia is a really good tracer for column density, even though you can see that there is a lot of emission outside these contours that it's present in the H2 map, but they are absolutely undetectable in ammonia maps because that is not it doesn't have the right densities or chemistry to be seen, but it means that it's not necessarily involved in the dense core populations. And then for each pixel, we can get a centroid and we can get a line width. And here you can see on the right-hand side, you will see the line width. This is the color scale. So whenever you see something very dark, that is usually subsonic. Elsewhere, it will be supersonic. And you can see that there are large pieces of the sky that are subsonic. So it's not just the core. So in this case, it matches much better with, this is a filament, so it matches much better with a filament is the place where you have the transition. But there are other places in the region on which it is much more related to the core itself. So it is not a unique universal answer, at least from these observations. L1688, also known as Ophiuchus main, you can see a lot of the stars here. Frederic did an amazing job giving us basically some of the original positions for all the cores in continuum. And those are basically a follow-up in terms of understanding what kind of core population is in Ophiuchus. And you can see again, there is all the contours from ammonia are here. They more or less match the H2. And even here you can see that there is a faint detection outside, like a halo. And that is actually a very faint detection of ammonia that we see across the whole cloud, but at a much lower signal to noise. And you can see here that line widths, again, where it's very dark cores and a very quick transition to broad lines. So the transition to coherence that we call, it happens very quickly, but it doesn't happen at the same scale all the time. Then we go to a place like Taurus, much more quiescent, lower density environment. And you can see that, again, the cores, they are very, very nicely mapped, but they do have some extensions. And if we go to the kinematic information, you can see that most of them, the dark patch is right at the center of the core. And then outside, you see some broad line widths. So this is a trend that systematically we see in many of these regions. And finally, this is the final region of the DR1, is Orion A. You have also seen beautiful images from either JWST. Alvaro also showed you some of these images. These are the whole map. It's all available. You can have access to the both the line widths and the kinematic information. You can see here, beautiful maps, quite smooth. And again, even in Orion, you can see dark islands in some places, and in other places you can see dark filaments. And even in other places you can see that maybe this is even more extended. So again, it's a bit of a mix, like a more complicated story. So if we just go back to one of these regions that we saw this kind of halo of faint emission. So we had a student, Spandan Chaudhary, basically we asked him to go at this region and try to extract a bit more information than what we did in the original data release. And basically we tried different techniques for exploring lower signal to noise signal. And we ended up with just going back to basics and smoothing the map to 1 arcminute. So that's twice the resolution that we usually had, half an arcminute. And you can see now that we can get velocity dispersion across the whole region. And we can get also temperatures across almost the whole region. And we can try to look at what happens in terms of temperature and line width if we focus on the core. And if we just put an annulus around the core, and then a second annulus further out. So then we can see that there is a core, shell 1 and shell 2, and you can see that the cores are usually cold-ish and very narrow line widths, Once you start to move outside of the core, the temperature quickly increases and it stabilizes, but the line widths are much larger. Okay? So in this case, we can see that the material that is around the cores is a bit warmer and turbulent. We try to see if there is a universal transition to coherence. And what we did is we just took all the regions that we mapped. Since we have temperature estimates, we can get an estimate of the Mach number at each point. And here we have a Mach number of 0.5 in black and 1 in red. And we try to see when do we see these subsonic regions. So if we have isolated objects, we just estimated the equivalent radius of that, and we put it in a bin. And then we did it for all the objects in the sample, and we get this distribution. You can see that it peaks at less than 0.1 parsec, but it has a strong tail, meaning that there is not a universal scale. There is maybe a typical scale, but it's not universal. Also, we try to look at the column density. Maybe it's a column density thing. If you look at the column density, it's again peaking at some point and then tapering off. So it's again not universal. We try to bootstrap some of the information from the continuum observation. So we went to the Scuba 2 catalogues that were available at the time, and we said, they have the catalogues of the cores, they know where they are, we know the kinematics of those cores, we can estimate if they're bound or not. And this is the video parameter. So basically, if you are below this dot line, you are bound by gravity. If you're above, you're not. Most of the objects are above this, which is a bit strange. And even some of these objects that are the red ones are protostellar. So even protostellar objects they're very unbound, which is odd. So in this case, many of these objects could be that the main effect is we don't have the right mass, because we're not considering the protostellar mass plus disk, the whole system. Maybe we're misaccounting that. Or actually, it's something else. Maybe in this case, if we just consider the external pressure from the cloud, maybe that can keep them bound. So that would be a fundamental shift on the idea of a dense core as an isolated object that is gravitationally bound and living its life by itself. So if we have access to this sensitivity, to these high sensitivity maps, and we look at the kinematics, we can say which other places are subsonic that we didn't know before. So we ended up looking at something like maps on which we looked for the typical line width and the line brightness, and we saw that there are many objects that are very faint, but they are actually subsonic. And we try to measure, for example, the mass as a function of effective radius. And the typical cores, the classical objects, they lie here, while these other objects that Hope Chen called them droplets, basically, they lie at lower masses, but they have the same line width, meaning if they have less mass but the same line width, they are less bound than the cores. And in this case, you can also plot like the line width, as I said, it's almost constant. So how do we put together this idea? Maybe they are just, we try to look if they're consistent with pressure confined spheres. Not so much. We compare the pressure from the best profile, the best model that we think for them. And this is the data for the different objects. Not a good match in terms of density profiles. Also, the density profiles, they have a much flatter profile than expected. So it's possible that these are objects that are on the way of forming a core. That would be kind of a nice idea that you can see the seeds of the future cores. Unfortunately, we also checked simulations to see what happens. And we track simulations and we track volume surfaces and masses and line width. And then we try to see if we try to identify them as objects, what do they do? Do they follow what we see or not? And basically here you can see we had to do some UMAP embedding to actually see, and prototyping to actually see that there are about 3 groups in the observations. And we can kind of put some scheme. So there are something like a turbulent phase where these objects, they might form a coherent core, or they might dissipate. Once they have in the coherent phase, they can go to a protostellar phase, or they can go back to the turbulent phase. And so it's a bit of a more complex picture that you can form these overdensities. Some of them will do star formation, and others will just dissipate. So it's very hard to do the accounting right. And if we look for a direct evidence for accretion, maybe we're seeing some of them. So in this case, this is a much deeper observation than what we did with gas, again by Spandan, and you can see that now we see that's the contour of the core as originally identified. And in the top, we see the narrow component, subsonic linewidths, and the supersonic linewidths. So now we see the cloud and the core plus some tail. And we can see in velocity, they're very coherent. So red, blue, and the cloud is doing something else. So we can really separate these objects. And it looks like it could be something like the accretion flows. So just going back to angular momentum, we just took the whole catalog of objects that we had from ammonia, and we estimated the J over M as a function of radius. And we see that it more or less lie on the previous data points, which is great. And it suggests that there is an exponent that is not solid body rotation, but it's not pure turbulence. It's something in between. If we go to slightly higher resolution data, then we can do the same for a small sample, 3 objects. It's good to get started. And we can see that we can plot the same angular momentum measurement, and it's a pure power law. We don't see the break. We don't see a region of conserved angular momentum. So maybe these objects are too small, too young to actually see the region of collapse. Maybe the region of collapse is just very, very small. And finally, where does it stop working, ammonia? So I love ammonia, but I know it fails at some point. So what we did is we had ammonia observations with the VLA, deep, nice observations. On the left, you see the ammonia integrated intensity, and on the right, you see the H2 column from dust. You can see right away that the dust has a strong peak here. Ammonia does not. That should tell you something. So if you go and take a look, you can calculate the ratio and get an abundance. You can already see a hole in the center. Here is lower abundance at the center. You can also look at it as a linear correlation. At low column densities, you see a linear trend. So ammonia works, and at some point, disaster. You cannot trace anything else. It just saturates. It looks a bit like some of the CO plots, right? Linear and then saturates. And it looks like that is the end of the regime that we can use ammonia, but it's still relatively high densities for us and high enough angular resolution that we can use it. And the future is almost here. We just got approved a large program with the VLA to map at 4x second resolution, so almost a factor of 10 improvement in angular resolution compared to gas, but only for the bright regions, because those are the only ones that we will be able to get a good signal. And the idea is to look for resolved angular momentum maps, try to provide much better temperature maps that other people can use for other purposes, so it has a legacy value for the community. And we're going to start observations this year, so stay tuned. So I'll just leave you with the summary since I'm running out of time. Thank you.
So, yes.
Thanks, Jaime. Just wondering, a quick question, if you see multiple velocity components in the ammonia, because you sort of said you could get the centroids and the line widths, and I just wondered how that might impact your dispersion measurements.
Yeah, so for example, we did that experiment Alvar also did it in NGC 1333. Basically, we did a Bayesian fitting for each component, and we do model comparison using the Bayesian evidence, and then we have this method that, for example, in this very complex region, we have either noise, one component, or two components. And you can see here, these are the fits. And if we look at the line widths, then the red and the blue shows the difference between one and two components. So even though what it does, it basically shifts it can shift the line widths a little bit. But if you compare with what we do, finally, it's similar, but it doesn't affect it. There are not enough pixels with that many multiple components to make an effect on the overall distribution.
Okay, so the interpretation of those plots then is you've done the homework on the multi-components, but the maps that you were showing were
single component.
Yeah, okay, got
yes, those are single components, but we checked that it's not messed up, right?
So last one, yes.
Yeah, when we look at cores, ammonia is the closest thing we get to N2H+. Mm-hmm. And now we've been discussing how N2H+ is so good because it's a selective dense gas tracer. Do we know how ammonia behaves at low column densities? Because when we look at the cloud, does it really trace the column density or does it trace the volume density?
So if we look at the integrating density compared to H2 columns, it's very linear. Unfortunately, the chemical models can basically, they don't do a good job in getting the right abundances, I would say. So, for example, we compare with some of the models from Oli, Sipila, and we have too much ammonia in the low density phase, which seems to be an issue for the low density phase, and likely not so much for the high density material.
But I mean, you have these beautiful maps with the GBT. Have you tried stacking the emission at very low column density and see it really in ammonia? Sorry, in N2H+, we see really a cutoff at around 10 to the.
In ammonia, you see that it continues, but the temperature and the line width, they change so much that the peak brightness, it plummets. So it's very faint, but since it is so broad, it contains a lot of flux. So and the temperature changes. So at the end, you end up with a trade-off where the line is fainter, but it's actually tracing as much column as the H2, more or less.
So the integrated intensity.
Yeah, the integrated it's a reasonable estimate for the column, but I would say that a priori, the main problem is that you don't know what abundance you should use for the low density one.
Yeah, well, I was thinking for extragalactic people observing clouds or galaxies in ammonia, which used to be popular many years ago. Are they observing dense gas or basically HCN is sensitive to all the column density?
I've asked some extragalactic people in the past and they were not very optimistic in targeting ammonia.
Okay.
Maybe we can convince them to give it a try.
Because so far we have only N2H+, so it would be nice to have another tracer.